All right, let's just get right to the point on this one. A few weeks ago, I received the following email. When I was at summer camp in New Hampshire, we would talk about hiking to a plane crash on a mountain from World War II. Would probably make for a good video if it's real. Camp was near Lincoln. I don't remember much else. Signed, Dave. Well, Dave, I think I can help you out with that one. Almost definitely, what our friend Dave is referencing here is a plane crash from January of 1942 that occurred in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And despite the brevity of his email, Dave actually touches on two big reasons why this plane crash is worth talking about. Number one, the plane was indeed a military craft, a B-18 bomber to be exact. And number two, the wreckage of the plane is still sitting up there in the mountains today. And not just like a tiny hunk of metal buried in the dirt. Most of that bomber is still on the side of the mountain where it crash landed over 8 decades ago. And today, we're gonna hike up there and take a look. But before we visit the actual crash site, I feel like we better slow down and discuss the story of the wreck in a little more detail. Because believe me, once you hear this whole narrative, that hike up the mountain is gonna take on an entirely different meaning. Get ready, because this one's a doozy. All right, so let's start things off at Westover Air Base near Springfield, Massachusetts. It is January 14th of 1942, and a B-18 bomber has just departed the base on a patrol mission. The plane's orders are to fly along the Atlantic coast and keep an eye out for enemy submarines. And at first, they did just that. The plane flew up and down the coast for a few hours looking for submarines, and then things started to go wrong. Snow and wind began to swirl around the plane, and clouds started to form and block the pilot's vision, and before long, the plane's crew had no idea where they were. And of course, part of the reason for that confusion was the weather, but then on top of that, the officers on board the plane also had very little experience flying B-18 bombers. See, the personnel for this mission had actually been cobbled together from other flight crews. There were 7 men on board in total, and none of them regularly flew this type of plane. This was a hodgepodge crew that was literally thrown together for this one particular mission. And so now what we have are 7 men hurtling through a snowstorm on board an aircraft that they only kind of know how to handle. The navigator in particular was having a really hard time. Like, the flight crew assumed that they must be somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, but even that was truly just a guess. Eventually though, the airmen did get a break. They came to a hole in the clouds, and they managed to catch a glimpse of city lights a few thousand feet down below them. And after a brief discussion, the men decided that they must be looking at Providence, Rhode Island, so they used that information to set a course for Westover Field, and off they went. Despite this new development though, the plane's problems were far from over. As the aircraft flew high over New England, ice began to build up on the wings. The weather was only getting worse, and at this point, the pilot was just about exhausted from constantly fighting against the wind. And so, in an effort to reduce the icing on the plane, the pilot decided to bring the plane down to warmer air and hopefully melt some of the ice off the wings. And thus, at about 7:45 p.m., the plane descended to 3,800 feet above sea level. And at the same time, in North Woodstock, New Hampshire, a woman named Franciana Hewitt was walking across her yard to her car when she looked up and saw an American military plane flying very low overhead. As the plane roared across the sky and disappeared into the snowy night, Franciana's heart dropped into her stomach because she knew that directly behind her house was a mountain. A massive explosion erupted through the darkness, and fire lit up the night sky, and poor Franciana got in her car and, with tears in her eyes, drove to the local police chief's house so she could report what she had seen. The city that the men on the plane had seen through the clouds had not been Providence, Rhode Island, but instead Concord, New Hampshire, over 100 miles away. The flight crew thought that they were flying over the relatively flat landscape of southern New England, but in fact, they were actually soaring directly into the Appalachian Mountains. So with very little warning, that plane just slammed into the side of a mountain called Mount Waternomee in central New Hampshire. And although Franciana Hewitt was the only person to actually see the plane before it crashed into the mountain, plenty of folk in the area heard that explosion and felt the shock waves as they rattled down the mountain. Like, houses for miles around began to shake, and high school dances and basketball games emptied into the street, and all the while, poor Franciana, the only person in town who knew for sure what happened, was tearfully trying to tell her story to the police chief when, boom, a second explosion rocked the valley. And then a third followed not too long after. The bombs on board the plane were now going off. 300-pound explosives were detonating inside the plane, absolutely obliterating the aircraft and hurtling debris all across the mountainside. By now, a small crowd of townsfolk had gathered near the base of the mountain, and they were watching as the fire above began to roar even brighter and brighter. And yet, in a truly incredible show of courage, the town actually began to assemble a rescue party. Less than half an hour after the plane first hit the mountain, a group of 12 local men started the long trek up towards the wreckage. And these were not professionals, not military men, just regular folk bushwhacking up a mountain at night in 2 feet of snow, deliberately headed towards an actively exploding plane crash that was 5 miles away from the nearest road. Of course, the rescuers were well aware that the chances of anybody actually surviving that kind of violence were low, but they pushed on anyway. They trudged through the ice and snow for hours until they heard a voice, a very faint cry for help. So the rescue party swung their flashlights around, desperately looking for the source of the noise, before finally their beams of light landed on 3 shambling figures dressed in bloody flight suits. Somehow, 3 of the plane's crew had not only survived the crash and survived the detonations of the bombs, but actually got up out of the snow and walked for a mile down the mountain. And they were hurt, of course, like with broken ankles and busted teeth, and one of the men had even been walking away from the plane when that first bomb went off, and the explosion launched a piece of debris that hit him in the shoulder and shattered his arm. But he was alive, and now these 3 men had some rescuers to help them down the rest of the mountain too. Like, amazingly, these 3 men had survived an absolutely brutal plane crash. Unfortunately though, prognosis for the other 4 men was not quite as rosy. After the plane blew up, I doubt that anyone up there could still be alive, said one of the survivors. But still, 3 men from the rescue party broke off and they continued up the mountain. And once again, human resiliency won out. 2 more of the flight crew were found lying in the snow, grievously wounded, but alive. By some kind of miracle, those 2 men had mustered up enough strength to crawl away from the plane before the bombs exploded. Unfortunately though, even miracles have to have limits, and sadly, the final 2 members of the 7-person crew either died on impact when the plane hit the mountain or were killed by the subsequent explosions. Their bodies were later discovered in the woods quite a ways away from the wreckage of the plane. But for the present moment at least, the rescuers had to worry about the 2 soldiers that they knew were alive. They had to get those guys off the mountain and find them some serious medical help. And that was going to be difficult because the men were in no condition to move. A local doctor on the scene thought that the survivors could safely be transported via toboggan, but even that seemed impossible considering the crash site was nestled into a thickly wooded area that was, again, 5 miles away from the nearest road. So they're not just going to throw these guys on sleds and send them down a steep, snowy mountain at night with tons of trees in the way. They had to come up with a plan. And so, what they did was get a local team of 25 to 30 lumberjacks to cut a path through the woods so that the 2 survivors could be safely brought down on toboggans. And by the way, while the axemen were chopping away through the woods, a local team of women also got together to pass out some coffee and sandwiches to the rescuers. So truly, this was a team effort by the townsfolk. Everybody was pitching in. And eventually, their efforts paid off. After a few hours of work, the path down the mountain was clear enough that the survivors could head down on toboggans. And after a very, very slow escort down the mountain, going as slow as 1/4 of a mile an hour in some places, eventually the men made it. After a truly admirable effort by the locals, 5 of the 7-man aircrew survived the crash. They made it down the mountain and, as far as I can tell, made full recoveries with proper medical care. I cannot stress enough how unbelievable of a rescue this was. I think my favorite part has got to be the 30 lumberjacks carving their way up the mountain at 4 in the morning, just hacking away in the darkness and 2 feet of snow, just making a beeline up the hill to try and rescue the soldiers. But overall, the whole town came together to rescue these guys. Later on, the army major who took command over the crash site would describe the wreck as the worst he had ever investigated, and he even referred to the location of the crash as, without a doubt, one of the most inaccessible and rugged spots where it ever could have happened, which to me just makes it all the more incredible that 5 men were saved almost entirely by the efforts of civilians who just so happened to be living in the area of the crash site. Of course, help from agencies like the National Forest Service was also critical in saving the crew, but overall, this was a rescue spearheaded by just regular folk. The Forest Service literally said that it would have taken days to find the wreck if the local townsfolk hadn't just immediately started walking up the mountain as soon as they saw flames. Through and through, these men were saved by the common folk of the New Hampshire mountains. And real quick, before we move on to the hike, I got one last little detail for you. The plane's co-pilot, a man named Woodrow Cantner, had actually been scheduled to fly to California on a different flight just a few days after the patrol crashed into the mountain. And of course, Cantner didn't make it onto that California flight because he was in the hospital recovering from the New Hampshire crash. And it's a good thing that he didn't make that California flight because that plane actually crashed in Nevada and killed every single person on board. So in a weird kind of way, crashing a plane into a mountain actually saved the life of Woodrow Cantner. It's kind of funny how those things work. But I think you've probably got the story of the crash in mind now, so how about we head up and see what's left of that plane in 2026. All right, here we go. It's finally time to go on a little hike and see if we can't find the remains of the plane crash. From what I can tell, I got a little ways to go on this mostly flat little stretch of out-of-use road here. And then we're pretty much just gonna make a hard turn and shoot straight up the mountain on a relatively steep trail. I got about 1.5 miles of walking to do, and during that 1.5 miles, we're gonna go up about 1,500 feet, which isn't crazy steep for an experienced hiker, but it's definitely more than enough to keep people away from going to visit the plane crash just casually, you know, like it's like this isn't exactly a spot that the local teenagers are gonna go like scope out as a potential drinking spot or whatever and take a casual hour-long hike up a mountain, you know. So because of that, because of the fact that it's a bit of an investment to actually go see this wreckage, supposedly the plane crash site is in pretty good shape and most of the plane is pretty well preserved. Typically, I would wait to film a video like this that involves a lot of wilderness walking until there's some leaves on the trees to kind of elevate the beauty of the landscape, you know. But I felt like for this one, being able to see through the trees would actually be an advantage, you know, so that we can better spot bits of the plane spread out among the woods. Also, in case you were wondering, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm fairly certain this road here did not exist during the time of the rescue. I imagine it would have made things a whole lot easier, but no, they had to be, all those townsfolk had to be piling through stuff like that. So I guess, you know, in the same way that the trees being bare is helping me find the plane crash now, probably also helped them find the plane crash way back when. I also read that there is some kind of like bronze plaque installed near the crash site somewhere that was put up in 1992 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the crash. So that's another thing to keep an eye out for. I don't know if you can see, but there is the mountain right ahead of us. So we got to get pretty close to the top of that. Just imagine, by the way, looking at that mountain and seeing just flames in the January night reflecting off the snow and hearing bombs exploding, man. And even having the courage to go charging up that mountain to try and save somebody's life despite that horrifying image. All right, say goodbye to the nice, easy grade road and say hello to an unmarked little tract powering up a mountain. Here we go. Hey, look at that. That's just gorgeous. All right, see, this is the peril of an unmarked trail. I think it goes this way. I believe I'm on the trail. I think it's still this. Okay, I actually think the trail crosses the river. So, where am I gonna do that? I guess this log. There we go. Yeah, okay. That looks 100 times more like a trail. All right. Here comes the climb. Yeah, so you can see why this place is kind of naturally gate kept from relic hunters and the like, because you kind of got to be ready, especially if you're trying to haul away a sizable piece of the plane or something like that. It'll get loose on you when you're trying to go downhill and chop your leg off at the knee. And as we're going up this stuff, just remember that the rescuers were doing this at night in below freezing temperatures when there's like 2 feet of snow covering the ground, and they're trying to carry down grievously wounded soldiers on sleds. Like, no wonder it took an hour to go a quarter mile at a time. And just imagine how insanely disorienting this whole experience must have been for the plane's crew also. because they thought they were over the relatively flat terrain near Providence, Rhode Island, and then all of a sudden they smash into a mountain and they crawl away from the wreck before the bombs start going off, and who knows where the hell they are. Because just look at that. Look how high up we are, and we're not even close to the plane crash site yet. You think you're over Rhode Island, and then you crawl out of a fiery wreck, and that's what you see. Or don't see even, because it was night. Depending on how bright the moon was, all you know is you're on a mountainside. Thank God none of the toboggans like got loose or anything too. Just imagine working so hard to save the lives of those people, and then one wrong move, and all of a sudden they're flying down the slope into the black of the night on a sled to who knows where. All right, so I actually read the map wrong before I started going up here, and it's 2.5 miles to the plane crash, because I was starting to think I'd definitely gone more than 1.5 miles. But that just gives even more credence to what I was saying earlier about how the relative remoteness of the crash site has allowed this place to kind of remain as a bit of a time capsule that only the truly most curious people would want to undertake a visit to. Which I think, you know, in the Venn diagram, the people that are most interested in going to visit the crash site, probably very heavy overlap with the people that would be the most respectful and devoted to its preservation. All right, any minute now, we should see some piece of metal peeking its way through the trees at us. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Wow, look at that. There's our first piece. Wow, with a little American flag. Our first piece of disfigured metal. Isn't it crazy to look at this and, you know, imagine that it went through not just a plane crash, but literal bombs exploding it to bits. And it just laid to rest here over 80 years ago. And now it still just sits here up on the side of the mountain. There's something kind of like bizarrely fascinating about seeing a functional piece of the plane like this that's still almost entirely intact. Like if you had the right piece, you could still screw whatever goes in there just right into that slot. It's pretty much entirely together still. Oh man, this really is just such a, holy cats, wow. The pictures that I saw online do not do this place justice. Like it's literally, you can see how the wreckage is just absolutely scattered across this hillside here. Look at that. Wow, I'm so glad I came here before the leaves really came out. Look at all that. I hope that comes across on camera, just the scale of how spread apart all this stuff is. So there's the piece we were just standing at right there down the hill. And then as you come up here, it's every step of the way, a new piece of the wreckage reveals itself. was. Like, holy cow, I've been, like, I'm just kind of walking off the trails around this area now, and the pieces of the wreckage are like truly never ending. Like, there's just more and more every direction you walk. There's some more here, and there's some up there. Like, it really is obvious that this plane was blown up. Like, holy cow, it's spread over such a wide area. There's just little pieces like this, just shrouded amongst the leaves everywhere. Like, I'm not sure how well it actually comes across on camera, but I hope you can see just how, like, this is just a field of metal. It's everywhere. Look at that. It's very difficult not to stand here and think about how terrified the plane's crew must have been. Many of them were so young too, like 20 years old. And all of a sudden, you climb out of a piece of fiery wreckage. Who the hell knows where you are? You're well aware that the aircraft you were just on board is packed with live bombs. And so, despite the fact that you just survived a plane crash, you gotta crawl away through the snow before the bombs go off. It's just unreal. Like, this spot here is quite a bit more affecting than I imagine it would be, to be honest. It's very hard not to feel a sense of empathy for how terrifying it must have been. And, you know, even the rescuers, it's much easier to understand where they get the courage from, imagining people stranded up here, even though they knew or assumed that probably nobody survived the crash. It is so high up too. Looking at these screws kind of plays with the imagination a little bit too, because, you know, at some point, some crew had to build this plane, and whoever put this together probably had no idea that a screw that they held in their hand ended up crashing into the side of a mountain in New Hampshire and just stayed there. Oh, and right there, here's the most famous piece of debris right there, because the star on the wing is still so clearly visible. See that? Well, I think that's going to be about it for today. I really don't have much else to say to wrap up the video. I kind of feel like this place just sort of speaks for itself. So, I'll see you next time, and I hope you enjoyed the video.